we come together from coast to coast to study your word, and your Holy Spirit can span the whole country to give us insight and give us experience in your word. Thank you for this group. Bless all the mothers and all the families that are celebrating their family unit and their unit in the kingdom. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. So last week last time we met, sorry, I'm muting my phone here. We met and discussed the first chapter of Habakkuk, and then we just barely got into chapter 2. So I think we covered verses 1 through 5, and we decided to stop before we got into kind of the woes. Let me share my screen here. And again, just kind of a reminder, I always like to look at this. I think the more I look at this, the more it's kind of in my head, which is very helpful when I'm studying the Bible, to kind of have a timeline picture in my brain when I'm doing it. But we're living in the Josiah period, which is kind of a revival time. And again, we talked a little bit last week about not quite being sure where Habakkuk falls. And we made some speculations on what, or who he's referring to in some of his the beginning parts. But at the end of the day, it's just that it's speculation. The second chapter is he's going to get into what are called by some of the scholars 6 woes, and or a taunt song, as it's called sometimes. And then that'll kind of bring us, I think, to the end of the kind of the second period here that we've been studying. So again, at the end, we're going to come back and to Joel when we talk about the day of the Lord, because it's very heavy about end times, what we call end times prophecy or eschatology. So I'm thinking Obadiah will be a really good place to go and talk a little bit about some of the surrounding nations. And Obadiah is very specific, a prophecy against the people of Edom or the people of Esau. And so maybe what we'll do is spend a little bit of time, a week or two, not just reading Obadiah, but just talking about the people of Esau and kind of where they fall, because their relationship with the Israelites is definitely one of great contention all throughout the Bible. So I think that's probably where we'll go. We've already just kind of studied Daniel, and so that'll kind of be the shortest, I think, phase, is kind of that time there, and then we'll get into that last phase of the minor prophets. Probably cover Haggai and Malachi together. And then we'll go back and kind of finish up with the day of the Lord, which would be Joel, Zephaniah, and Zechariah. So that's kind of how I'm picturing it. It's a little bit different than I had projected in the beginning, but I think that will actually help us to cover most of the books. And it seems like a lot of you guys were interested in doing that. So it might take us a year to get there. I don't know. We move pretty slow, but I'm always thankful to meet with you guys, because I continue to learn as I study, but then as I sit down and listen to you guys, it's always beneficial. And I hope you guys are getting as much out of it too. You keep coming, so I assume you are. All right. So chapter 2, I think what we'll do is we'll just take this one of these sections the way I've sectioned this off, if you guys are okay with that. We'll just talk about one at a time. It might take us a while to get through, but we'll try to get through the entire book of Habakkuk today, and we'll see what happens. So again, this is now the word of God coming to Habakkuk in a prophecy, and we kind of read the first 5 verses. And so verse 6 kind of gets us into, what I'm sectioning as the first woe. And so verses 6, 7, and 8 kind of cover that. And so, Tyler, if you don't mind, would you mind reading verses, it's again, chapter 2, verses 6 through 8?
Okay. Will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his, for how long, and makes himself rich with loans? Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them. Because you have looted many nations, all the remainder of your peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town and all of its inhabitants.
So it seems like, at face value, that this first woe is against those whose selfish ambition leads them to, trample, I guess, over others or have contempt for others. Obviously, many of the rulers that have come up and conquered, that's exactly what it is. It's just this uncontrolled ambition that leads them to leave their own territory and go into other territories and conquer. This isn't really related directly, but I think it's always good to compare these woes with the Torah and what God's instruction were for others, and how God, even when he talked about loans and when you borrow from each other, he set up a very specific set of instruction towards that. And so this reminded me of Deuteronomy 24 as just an example of one of these such instructions. And in verse 10, it says, when you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not enter his house to take his pledge. You shall remain outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. If he is a poor man, you shall not sleep with his pledge. When the sun goes down, you shall surely return the pledge to him, so that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it will be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. And so, it wasn't right for you to, even if you had, took something as, I guess, what we would call hawk today. I think that's generally kind of the same idea, that there's a set of ways to do this that is right towards your fellow man. And when you're treating your man accordingly, it is considered righteousness. And that's a pretty clear contrast to what's going on here in verses 6, 7, and 8. So I don't know if anybody has anything to add to that, or anything specific sticks out to you guys.
That's kind of a new take for me, because I thought this was all about the Babylonians and the Chaldeans who would just take, but it could be going back and forth. We kind of saw that in the first chapter, so I'm toying with the structure to see how that plays
well,
out.
And maybe to expound a little bit on my thought, Reva, I definitely agree with you that I think that these woes are specific to the people of Babylon. I think my thinking in pointing out Deuteronomy 24 was just showing how different God's instruction to his people, and when you take loans, for example, you weren't allowed to charge interest to your fellow man, to your fellow Jew, or to your fellow son of Jacob. However, you were allowed to charge interest to foreigners, and you have these different laws that take into account this idea of taking a loan. And even when you talk about this verse 6, and makes himself rich with loans, it almost seems like the loans in this case aren't talking about actual loans, but going out and stealing, right? Taking property from from the other nations going out and conquering. But I don't disagree with you. I don't take this as being a woe against the people of
Judah.
Israel necessarily. Yeah, Judah necessarily.
Yeah, because to me, there's tension talking about that the creditors or the debtors will rise up against you, and I don't see any historical aspect where all of a sudden the debtors rose up against the creditors in Judah.
Right.
But I do see in this illicit gain of the Babylonians, and that they had a lock on all commerce up and down the Euphrates River, and people just got tired of having to pay out so much money just to go up and down the river. And what happened to Babylon is the Medes and the Persians especially ganged up on them and despoiled them. In Isaiah 13, which is another apocalyptic picture of the day of the Lord, it uses the Medes who say the Medes will come and they don't care about silver and they don't care about gold, and they will be ruthless with you in Babylon. So I see something similar to that, but of course Isaiah is like 150 years before Habakkuk. So
right.
Thank you for helping me look at this in a new complexity here.
To just make it more confusing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do think that the big thing here is just this idea of when you have uncontrolled selfish ambition, which seems to be it seems to stem from pride mostly, but it often leads great men and women to do things that trample on their fellow neighbors. And I think that's that's the big here with the woe, is not just that you have ambition, because I think ambition can be a great motivating factor and a great gift, but you do see these rulers, Alexander the Great, obviously Nebuchadnezzar here, and we talked about, is it Ashurbanipal from Assyria, who they just, what they have isn't enough, and they make these amazing great kingdoms, but they tend to, when they do it, they're trampling their fellow man, and God uses it. It's very clear that God is going to use that selfish ambition. It's the same pride, well, maybe not the same, but it's similar to the pride that Pharaoh had, and his unwillingness to relent gave God an opportunity to show great wondrous signs. And and a lot of times the great miraculous things that happen stem from things like this selfish ambition that these rulers have. So.
Yeah. Just a note, there is this theme in Habakkuk where God is punishing Judah with a more ruthless and wicked, kind of trying to teach them that the track that they're on is going to lead them into the same type of ruthlessness with the poor that Babylon shows. There's this question, why to God, why do you punish a less wicked people with a more wicked people?
Right.
Do you know what you're doing?
Okay. So the second woe is 9 through 11 is kind of how I section that. Again, this is pretty common way to section these things off. I think some of you probably even have breaks. Brandon is really good about showing us in the Masoretic text the natural breaks that are made. And a lot of times how they do it is certain verses are clumped together and then there's a break. And there's reasons the Masoretes decided to break those there, and they're not always in line with the way the verses are break. But I think some of these breaks here, you know, line up with a lot of, you know, other Bibles, the way they read. And Jennifer, you shared about yours being very similar before. So again, nothing really original here, but these are just to help us to kind of see the difference between each of these woes. So Sarah, would you be willing to read the second one, verses again, chapter 2, verses 9 through 11?
Yep, for sure. Okay. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples, so you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework.
So to put his nest on high is that's an allegory that's used throughout the Bible quite a bit. If you think about it, it kind of has this connotation of, again, exalting yourself, again, putting yourself up in a high place. But also, there's a reason that fortresses were always built on high places, and that's because of the tactical advantage in warfare. And also, you know, you think about the other things that are always put on high places, and that's idols, right? And Asherah poles and things like that. So whenever we talk about this idea of putting your nest on high, it's often compared to an eagle, because the eagle, if you think about the predators of the sky, there's no greater predator than the eagle. And the eagle tends to be one of the highest flying birds. It tends to be a bird that is solitary. It doesn't need a flock to live, and it's and it tends to build its nest. It tends to be one of the higher nests that is, you know, safe in a way. And so there's some of this allegorical literature that is all throughout the Bible, and I've pulled in out just a few. Again, each of these really are talking about the self-exaltation and the pride that comes with this. And it's often a woe to, you know, or a prophecy against specific groups of people. So in Job 39, we read in verse 27, again, he's speaking. I can't remember the context here. I've lost it. I can't remember if he's talking to God at this point or if he's still talking with his friends. So if anybody knows, please feel free to share after we read this. Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the cliff he dwells and lodges, upon the rocky crag in an inaccessible place. From there he spies out food, his eyes see it from afar, and his young ones also suck up blood. And where the slain are, there he is. And so generally you kind of see the nest on high referring to the eagle here. And then Jeremiah 49 is actually a lament against, I think this is a prophecy against Babylon, if I remember. It is, yeah, because the book of Jeremiah basically ends with 2 chapters against Babylon and then a final chapter of the downfall of Israel, of Judah. And it's very interesting the way it's constructed, if you think about it. Jeremiah, very similar to Habakkuk, comes out, and chapters 49 and chapters 50 are God giving Jeremiah his prophecy against Babylon and what the end product of Babylon will be, which is basically their destruction. And then right after that, it talks about the Babylonians and how they came in and finally destroyed Jerusalem. But anyway, Jeremiah 49:16, as for the terror of you, again, you being Babylon or the kingdom of Babylon, the arrogance of your heart has deceived you, O you who live in the clefts of the rock, who occupy the height of the hill. Though you make your nest as high as an eagle's, I will bring you down from there, declares the Lord. We're going to read in a couple weeks here, when we get into Obadiah, we're going to see the same exact language used against the people of Edom. And so this is a pretty common theme throughout the Bible. And again, it always seems to talk about the exaltation and the pride. And whenever you think about things on high, it always has this connotation of putting yourself above God. I don't know if anybody has anything to add to that or anything that stood out to you.
Would you think that that might be compared to the Tower of Babel?
Yeah.
You know, what you just said, it made me think about how trying to escape God, you know, and I think many times we're seeing science do that right now.
Yeah. And again, it is always attributed as the great sin of the devil, right? Was his pride and willing, you know, all of these things you see in the kings of Babylon. You see, you know, the same things that are touted against what many people attribute to Satan. So yeah, it's a great point. Babel was that's why it was such a big deal, right? That's why the Tower of Babel was such an abomination to God, and he intervened directly into that to keep that from happening.
Yes.
All right. We'll go ahead and move on here to the third woe. And Elizabeth, if you'd actually be willing to read, go ahead and read verses 12 through 14.
Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. It is not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire, and nations grow weary for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
Now, does your verse 13 read, it is or is it?
Is it not indeed?
Okay. I might have just misheard you. I thought I heard you say it is, but
I may have misspoken. It's early.
It is early. It is early. No problem. So the third woe seems to center around how people are building and how people are coming to power. And again, this is another common theme of man, is that when you build, it's on the backs of slaves. It comes from war. You come in, you conquer, you destroy, and then you have to rebuild because of the destruction. Fires are often set. Was Jerusalem razed? I can't remember if the town of Jerusalem, when Nebuchadnezzar came in, if it talks about him putting it on fire. I don't feel like I ever read that, but I do know that much of it was destroyed.
I know he didn't want to destroy the temple.
Yeah.
So gorgeous, but it ended up being destroyed just because I'd often heard it was kind of accidental. Someone threw a torch in, and it caught on fire all the wood. Other than that, I don't know.
Okay. And I'm not sure if verse 13 is talking about that. But again, when you think about fire, that was the first thing I thought of is fire is often used to destroy a city before you go in and you rebuild. But there might be another meaning there that's eluding me.
I'm just wondering that people's toil for fire. I'm not understanding that reference.
Yeah.
Is it because they need the fire to refine silver and gold? They need fire to cook. What does it say in
I think the sense is there that they build up just to be destroyed.
Okay, that makes sense. And does that also an end time thing? Because it says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be speaking of the end times.
Yeah.
Is it equating fire with the glory of the Lord? People strive for fire, and what they're really wanting is the glory. a knowledge and presence of God.
Kind of, verse 13 is kind of put in juxtaposition against verse 12.
Brandon, you're a little quiet. Would
Oh,
you mind
sorry.
just-
Can
yeah,
you
that's
hear me?
right. Sorry.
I'm sitting way back. I said verse 13 is kind of put in juxtaposition against verse 12. So, the context of what we're looking at is what Elizabeth said about, the cities being, they're building up these cities from bloodshed and violence, but, they're going to be destroyed with fire. Someone already said that about how a lot of times the cities would be destroyed, burn it down before rebuilding on it. So I think that's what we're looking at here.
Yeah. But I definitely agree. And that's, you can see I colored it differently. Verse 14. We're going to see this here again in a moment, but when it talks about the sea, anytime it talks about the sea, rivers, or large body of waters, I shouldn't say any time. The majority of times it's referring to people or a peoples or a great many peoples. And that's a pretty common allegorical take on, on that. So when it talks about waters covering the sea being the people, that's the idea of the glory of the Lord, or the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the entire earth. And clearly that's not quite the state we're all living in on this day. So I definitely agree with you, Elizabeth, that seems to be talking about the end times. And so maybe there is something to verse 12 and 13 that is also tied to that.
Yeah, because you're saying the whole earth is going to have knowledge of God's glory, right? It's not just knowledge of God there; it's of His glory, which as we were looking at Isaiah yesterday, and some of the other things we looked at with Him coming down and being present again in Jerusalem in His glory. Talks about His glory being over the city. Right, so it definitely seems like an end times thing to me.
That's one of the themes that's building up to chapter 3 is that God is using Babylon and other empires to buffer the day of the Lord, so that there's instead of God pulling the plug on humanity too fast, he uses the empires, and you get a sense that this is building to the day of the Lord.
Yeah. So the fourth woe here is starts to talk about drink and a couple other things. I'll go ahead and read this one. This is the fourth row, verse 15 through 17. It says, "Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom, even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup is in the Lord's right hand. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all its inhabitants." And so this one, there's a couple things that stood out to me on this one. Anytime you see this verbiage around drinking or being made drunk, often is equated with the wrath of God. That verse 15 is probably not as clear as verse 16 when it talks about the cup is in the Lord's right hand, or the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around you. The idea here is that Babylon will make the nations drunk through abominable acts. In the same way, God will make Babylon drunk through his wrath. And I'll show you just a couple of things that kind of tie into this thought, or at least have me thinking this way. In Jeremiah 59, verse 7, it says, Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, intoxicating all the earth. The nations have drunk her wine, therefore the nations are going mad. And so, Babylon being a cup in the hand of the Lord, I think seems to indicate that God is directing exactly what Babylon is doing. He is in control of, and he is using Babylon according to his will. Revelation 16 is known as the fall of Babylon, right? The final fall of Babylon. And so we know that Babylon is a symbol for many things. If you go all the way back to the Tower of Babel, that's where it began, right? And now we see this kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar's being used, and in the end, the final kingdom set up by what are referred to as the beast and the false prophet, that kingdom is also referred to as Babylon. And so Revelation 16, if you read verses 1 and 2, it says, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Again, waters being this idea of being over many peoples, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and with those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. So this idea of uncovering people's nakedness, although the story goes, right, alcohol has long been used to lead to other things. The idea, I think, overarching here is this idea of that when someone becomes drunk, great acts of wickedness are committed, right? And so when you uncover your skirt or you uncover your nakedness, sometimes that refers to the act of sex, but often it's this idea of disgraceful acts, all sorts of disgraceful acts. And so that's kind of how you see that coming down. If you continue in verse 19, it talks about the great city. Again, this is the great city called Babylon, was split into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of wine of his fierce wrath. And so now you see this idea of wine. When men talk about, a nation becoming drunk or people becoming drunk from a nation, it tends to refer to acts of violence or wickedness or evil. When it's referred to as being coming from God, the cup of wine of God is almost always referred to, in the context of his wrath, his wrathful vengeance, or his justice being done. Jeremiah 25, going back to the beginning, towards the beginning of Jeremiah 25, in verse 15, it says, for thus the Lord, the God of Israel, says to me, take this cup of the wine of wrath from my hand and cause all the nations to whom I send you to drink it. They will drink it and stagger and go mad because of the sword that I will send among them. And so I think that's what you see going on here in Habakkuk in this woe, is the beginning talks about the neighbor's drink, right? You're making them drunk so as to look at their nakedness. There's these evil acts going on. There's acts of immorality that are coming. But then in 16, it turns to the cup in the Lord's hand will come around to you. And when that comes, utter disgrace will come to you. In verse 17, it talks about, and this is going kind of in a little bit different direction, but the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you. And it made me think of Deuteronomy, and I mentioned this in our group yesterday, Brandon. Deuteronomy chapter 20, 19 through 20 is talks about siege works. It gives Torah on how to go in and which trees to cut down. It's very specific. Lebanon, and I actually got this idea from somebody else. This was Lebanon. If you go to Lebanon today, it's pretty much so a waste. There's not trees. There's not any splendor. It's really a desolate land. And but when you hear in the Bible, you always hear about the cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan, right? We just read that yesterday in Isaiah chapter 3, I think. And God was very specific in his siege works. And he said very specifically, when you go in to lage sea works and you cut down trees, you are only allowed to cut down trees that do not bear fruit. So this idea of if there's food on it, it is not okay to cut that tree down to use for acts of war. But trees that are not, that don't bear fruit, those are the ones you cut down, and those are the ones you use. And what happens is people go in and they keep cutting, and it takes, you know, what is plentiful, what used to be a plentiful place, and becomes kind of, you know, desolate. And I don't know if that's what happened to Lebanon. Again, this is just a conjecture, but I just think that that's interesting, that God's Torah is so amazing that it even expands to how to wage war. And Lebanon is a place that is, you don't see cedars in Lebanon. You just don't see those things, and it's because of the acts of man and the things they did. So that's going a little bit differently than 15:16. But those are kind of my thoughts on it, and I'm sure there's plenty there for you guys to share. So let me know what you guys think.
Well, the one thing that really stands out to me, in verse 15, it says, "You make them drunk so that you may look on his nakedness," and that's that takes me right back to Noah and what happened with him and Ham and his wife, and you know, that, and I want to say Leviticus 20 is where it uses that phrase, to look on someone's nakedness, to refer to sexual acts with that person. So, you know, looking at this, you know, to me, the whole idea here is, you know, mixing that, it's, you know, that they're basically raping the nations. That's kind of the idea that I see going on there. And well, I didn't realize, looking at the Hebrew, you know, it says, "Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness," and I guess you have the NASB up there, right? But it says, "You'll be shown as being uncircumcised" in Hebrew. So, you know, that's even different, right?
And you're talking about right here, this right here would be akin to being uncircumcised?
No. The next verse in 16, it says,
the disgrace.
Yeah, you'll be shamed, you'll be disgraced, and be shown to be uncircumcised. And where it says expose your own nakedness.
That's interesting.
Yeah, the next line down as well, it says when that word in yours, it
expose.
says nakedness. Yeah, expose your nakedness. So I mean, that's just interesting to me that, you know, this the things, you know, I'm always thinking when I read stuff, let me go backwards in the Bible and look at what's there, because oftentimes the writers want you to think about certain things. In that act with Ham and Noah's wife there in Genesis, tied to, you know, the same act that Absalom, and David's concubines, right, where he raped his concubines out in the public. It's, you know, that the whole idea there has to do with power, with them exhibiting power over, right, and conquering, and you know, that's what Babylon does. That's what the world, you know, that mystery Babylon that we see in Revelation, right? It's not just the city of Babylon. In this case, you know, maybe referring to the Babylonians, or to the king, but that, you know, as a symbol of the way of the world. That's what the world does.
Mhm.
It conquers and overpowers and controls, and then it's shown. It's uncircumcised, right? It's not. It's fleshly and not of the ways of Yahweh.
Is there any significance to the cup being in the Lord's right hand?
We would probably comment on this too, but all the stuff I've seen, I mean, who is at the Lord's right hand?
Yeshua.
Yeshua, right? And there's other references to the right hand of God that would lead us to kind of equate Yeshua with the right hand of God. So that's the way I see it. Not everybody sees it that way.
Yeah,
I would agree that the Lord of hosts, which they talked about, the Lord of armies, especially in Isaiah, is Yeshua, the Holy One of Israel, the Redeemer. And he's the one that metes out the conquest of the earth in the end.
And that goes along with some of the Second Temple ideas of the Messiah, right? Everybody expected the Messiah to come with the sword, and this is one of the reasons why.
Yeah, and to your point, Elizabeth, if you read Revelation 19, it makes a direct reference to Isaiah 63. And Isaiah 19:15 says, he treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. And the clothes are also soaked, this time with blood. It talks about his clothes being soaked with blood. And it's referring to, it's a direct reference to Yeshua. And Isaiah 63, if you read the beginning of Isaiah 63, it expounds on that. And it talks about, I went out and I have trodden the winepress alone, and no one from the nations was with me. It's this idea of, the right hand of God going out and bringing God's wrath against the nations. And so just something, if you guys want to read, again, Revelation 19 and then Isaiah 63, those two things are directly tied to each other. And it's all about, the wine press, right? And wine generally means blood, but also this idea of being drunk, and so maybe that's another connection with drinking or becoming drunk, is generally when people were drinking in Israel, it was wine. That was the drink of choice, and wine is red like blood. And so it's a pretty natural, I think, symbol to be used for bloodshed.
And and we might also think about how the priests were told not to drink before they approached God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if there's some symbolism of drunkenness and the wine, that they are being removed from God also. They can't approach his presence.
Yeah. Man. That's some deep verses there, man. There you go. Who knew the minor prophets were full of such great stuff, Not me. So a couple more woes here. Or maybe I lied, one more woe here. And so verse 18 through 20. Brandon, if you'd be willing to read 18 through 20.
Yeah, I'll read it just from yours. What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood, or its maker trusts in his own handiwork, and he fashions speechless idols? Woe to him who says to wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise, and that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. Yahweh is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him.
So this kind of ends, this taunt song ends in a comparison of all the false gods out there to God in heaven. You know, verse 20 says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. It could be a reference to the temple of earth, but we also know that everything that was made on earth was made as a representation of what's going on in heaven. And ultimately, God Most High, that's where his dwelling place is in heaven. Although it is often spoke of when he came to the tabernacle, or when, you know, David decided to make it, the idea was to make a dwelling place for the Lord. And Ezekiel, the beginning of Ezekiel, the first 6 chapters of Ezekiel are very specific in describing how this no longer is the dwelling place, because his spirit, right, in the wheels, we've talked about this, is being taken back up to heaven. So ultimately, although this probably is partially about the temple here on earth, ultimately I would guess that this is a reference to God's dwelling place in heaven. Let all the earth be silent before him, I think it goes back to the knowledge of the glory of the Lord covering the entire earth, and might be, you know, referencing, you know, kind of back to that idea.
Yeah, I see the difference, you know, that talk about the idols, you know, we see that in quite a number of places. You know, they're worshiping the things they make with their hands. You know, but the NASB says there's no breath in it, but that word for breath is ruach, right?
Yeah.
Which means also spirit. So the belief of those who worshipped the idols was that they would make this idol, and then, you know, as they worshiped it, the spirit of whatever being that is would come down and be in that idol. So he's saying, no, that's not the case. And then we see that he says, no, Yahweh is in his holy temple. You know, he's different. He's always in his temple, right? He's always there. You know, just kind of like the difference between those two ideas.
Yeah, that's a contrast of the living God
Sure.
versus the toy God.
Yeah.
And, you know, ultimately, false worship of idols and putting other things before God is one of the great sins. It's the first 2 of the 10 commandments are direct, you know, contrast to this. And so obviously it's a very important thing. And you know, I don't know what the names of the gods off the top of my head were of Babylon. Does anybody know which gods did they worship?
They worship Bel. They worshipped Tammuz. They were very polytheistic.
That's
but
right. Yeah.
Their main patron was Bel.
Yeah, a lot of the gods of other nations had equivalents in Babylon.
Yeah. And so, you know, the chapter as it kind of wraps up, I mean, this is God's taunt against, it's directly in, you know, a taunt to Babylon. I think that's pretty clear, and what they will do. But you start to see some of the tie-ins. And again, remember that Jeremiah was a contemporary of Habakkuk, and kind of in this time, it's likely that Jeremiah was saying some of these same things, or maybe just after him. Jeremiah was probably a little bit later than when most people put the book of Habakkuk, but right around, you know, that time. And you can see it's very some similar verses there that seem to say the same thing. So anything else in chapter 2 before we move on to chapter 3?
I might just add a historical note, and I was struck at our last meeting about the tablets, and it could be that Habakkuk was intended to be a prophecy read by the first wave of captives in Babylon. And because it was written on clay,
Right.
clay tablets, and then this idea of him climbing the tower, I think shows that they've already experienced the wrath of Babylon in one wave, and possibly the second wave, but they still have a wall to stand on and survey the hillsides and who's coming. After the third wave, there was nothing left of Babylon. It was all the walls and streets were plowed back into vineyards. That was the only use Nebuchadnezzar had for Jerusalem after the third. I put the writing of the book, I think, coming into the third chapter, I suspect that Habakkuk, because this is the only use of Selah in that third chapter, outside of the Psalms. And I think Habakkuk might have been a Levitical singer in the choirs of Jerusalem, and the choir is no more.
Yeah.
They're taken into captivity.
Yeah, and Jeremiah speaks directly about the priests and the Levites who were taken into captivity. There at the end of the last chapter, Jeremiah speaks specifically of them. So chapter 3 is going to kind of change directions here. This now, after Habakkuk has had this kind of back and forth with God, even though, again, he admits in this book at the beginning of chapter, or at the end of chapter 1, that there is a question in his mind about the righteousness of, or lack of righteousness, right, of the people who are coming in to destroy Jerusalem. He says, I will wait, to hear the matter out fully at the beginning of chapter 2. And so God answers him, and he reads these woes, or hears these woes from the voice of God, and records them. And as in this new knowledge, he responds with this song. And I mean, this very easily could be thrown right into many of the Psalms are very, very similar. I didn't really go through to take the time. I had thought about it, but I mean, gosh, there's so much in here that you also see in the Psalms. You could probably do a couple weeks just kind of talking about the language here and how similar it is in a lot of places. So I think we'll go ahead and read through this. I think I'm going to break it into where it's Salah, right? Isn't that how you say that?
I'll say it that way. Okay.
Well, then I will too. And so maybe we'll split this first one. We'll just go verses 1 through 9. That seems to be a good break. So Riva, if you don't mind reading verses 1 through 9 in chapter 3.
Okay. I think I'll just read it from the NASB that you have open there.
Okay, great. I'll make it a little bigger for you then.
A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shigionoth. Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Selah. In Habakkuk was the main source that I used in a seminary paper to understand what Selah was and how it worked in the Psalms. Selah was a break in the music or in the worships to bow down so that God's presence could come through. And you can see in the next line, that's what happens right after Selah. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand. I imagine when the Lord of hosts comes back, because of the nail prints in Yeshua's hands, that lightning flashes out of those nail prints. Because I have a vivid imagination, if you haven't caught on to my spiel. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his power. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered. The ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. Did the Lord rage against the rivers? Or was your anger against the rivers? Or was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare. The rods of chastisement were sworn. The second Selah.
So just a couple things that stood out to me, and then I'll let you guys share anything that you see there. When he talks about, so Taman, and this is something I think we're going to talk about a little bit more when we get into Obadiah. A lot of times names are used in the minor prophets, and if you don't know who those names are attached to, that it almost always is talking about a specific people. And so here you have Taman and Mount Paran, and this is talking about Edom. And I think generally the idea, and this is a general theme in the Bible, that God comes from the east, right? And Edom was to the east, southeast, but they were to the east of Judah, right? So they were below them, but also to the east. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 2, it says, he said, and I'm trying to think, I can't remember whose song this is. If this is, I think this is one of the songs of Moses. This isn't the song of Moses, but I think that this might be one of his things that he wrote. I just can't remember off the top of my head. But it says, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. And he came in the midst of 10,000 holy ones. At his right hand there was flashing lightning for them. So Mount Seir, Paran, Taman, these are all names for Edom. And so it could be that he's talking about just the idea that God generally comes from the east. I'm not quite sure what else that would be referring to specifically. And I don't know if anybody has any ideas there differing, but that was kind of my take away from it.
So some people have the idea that Sinai was in Edom just for this reason, but I look at it more of, when they came out of Sinai, if you look at a map, going with that Sinai was in Saudi Arabia, which is what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go up and come through Edom, right?
Right.
To get up into the land. So you go through all these areas, and so that's to me what it means. You're coming up around those. They, whichever way you're trying to come. If you try to come from the south, you have to go through it. If you go around to the east, you're coming through it. It's you have to go through it, and so that's the way I look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, and and I don't know if this is of important note, but it is of worthy, I think, noting that the people of Israel, when they came through Edom, if you remember, they were not allowed through, and they offered to pay the people of Edom for even the water that their animals drank. And Edom said, nope, you got to go around. And so God said, I'm not gonna, help you through. You need to go around. And so they had to actually go around Edom, which took all that much longer.
Yeah, I would take note that when Moses dies I believe it's the end of Deuteronomy, God takes him to the top of Mount Paran to look at the whole promised land and into the future even. So that I think Mount Paran, you see this also in Ezekiel with the Battle of Gog and Magog, where God entices the nations to come up onto the mountains of Israel, and then he comes from Paran from the south. Now, Teman seems like it's the mountain that kind of marks the northern border of Edom or Seon. So you have like these two mountains set from the top of them, and the Edomites and the Ammonites, they were kind of mountain people also, like Judah and Israel. So God comes storming from basically the south to the north to meet Gog and Magog in Ezekiel.
Yeah.
And that's what they did in the conquest, right? They went up north and conquered Og of Bashan, right?
Yeah.
Same idea there, huh? That's I never thought about that together.
Is Paran and Seir, are they the same mountain? Or are those? I know they're in the same location because they both refer to Edom. I don't know if those are the same mountain or if anybody knows if those are distinct mountains.
I don't know.
I'm still trying to look at maps that have all of those things on it at the same
I might have to
time.
look into that and see. But just it's generally again noteworthy because there's a number of prophecies specifically against Edom. I don't think this is one of them, but Teman, Paran, and then we're gonna actually talk about Amalek a little bit. Amalek was the firstborn grandson of Esau. And talk a little bit about that when we get into God, because God had a very specific hatred for Amalek, and his command in the Torah was to eradicate the people of Amalek, and I think that when we go through that, we can see how that ties into some of the prophecies against Edom. Anyway, that's further down the road, but so that's the idea, and I think that you both make great points about him coming through the south and coming through. It's almost in a conquering manner or state of being, maybe. His splendor covers the heavens. His radiance, again, before him goes pestilence, plague. We continue to see that, right? Pestilence, plague, sword, famine. Those are the judgments of God. And so whenever you see those, wild beasts is included in there. That is common about the justice that God brings in his righteous judgment towards the nations. The perpetual mountains were shattered, the ancient hills collapsed. Again, this is the idea of the mountains and hills being brought into valleys. I always call it terraformation, but that's just the idea of massive land changes, right? Again, is that symbolic or physical? We will see, right? But it's there. And then, was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea? My guess, and it's just a guess, is that this is just talking again about peoples, referring to peoples. But maybe there's something more there, and I'd love to hear any of your guys' thoughts if you think it's something different. But that's generally what I think of when it talks about covering the rivers or the sea.
Going back to pestilence and plague, these pestilences and plagues are directly attributable in in the Old Testament, even in the Torah, to the presence of God. So in, I believe it's Numbers 12, when God calls out Miriam and Aaron because they spoke ill of Moses, they looked at Miriam and she was covered with leprosy. And also there was a king, Asa, I believe, that took incense into the sanctuary, and he was struck with, or is it Uzzah? Uzziah.
Uzziah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
good to have a group that can correct the wanderings of your mind. And also in the sea being laid bare, in Psalm 18, there's a very similar depiction, and it talks about the sea being laid bare down to the foundations of the earth, and it has this lightning and hail and the same depiction. This is not unique among the prophets or even among the psalmists. That I tend to take this as an apocalyptic description of how God will ruin the earth.
I'd like to go back to verses 2. I guess actually it's all in verse 2 at the very beginning. He's going through how Israel is going to be punished and then Babylon is. And there are two things I'd like to bring up about that. I am awed, O Lord, by your deeds. Renew them in these years. He was asking for God to redo what he had done to them previously. But then this reminds me of Moses. Though angry, may you remember compassion.
Yeah. And I'm
Good
thinking
point.
thinking of when Moses when God becomes angry and God says he's going to destroy all of them and restart with Moses' seed. Is that what you're talking about, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a great
And
point.
then we also may think about Abraham when he's pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah.
And God, God has precedent. There's precedent for God listening when people ask for mercy.
Yeah.
His saints and then groups of people, right? I mean, Joel talks about it. There's a couple prophets we read about it, I think, in Amos. Everybody pray. Perhaps God will relent. Perhaps instead of judgment, he will bring compassion.
And now is he also praying for God's mercy and compassion on Judah? Or is he praying also for God's compassion on these other nations like Babylon?
Yeah.
It's I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it's hard to know specifically. I think the obvious answer is Jerusalem, because you would think that would be first in his heart, but it's a good point. I mean, we don't know, and it could be a general plea for mercy.
Because we have Abraham pleading for a wicked city that God's going to destroy, and then we have Moses praying for God's people who just delivered from Egypt. So it's I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. So the second part and again, I don't think it's the second part. This is probably all one thing put together, but maybe we'll go ahead and read through the rest. Craig, would you be willing to maybe read right after the Selah in verse 9 through the end of the chapter?
Sure. You cleaved the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and quaked. The downpour of waters swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation, you marched through the earth. In anger, you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You struck the head of the house of the evil to lay him open with thigh to neck. Salah. You pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble. Because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hens' feet, and makes me walk on my high places. For the choir director on my stringed instruments.
It's all right. It's early for you too. Thanks, Craig. There was a lot there. I probably could have split that into two, but because of time, I figured maybe we would go ahead and just try to knock it all out. But man, there's so much there. Verse 11, sun and moon stood in their places. We know there's lots of eschatological views on what will happen in the end, but definitely lots of talk about the sun and the moon turning red to darkness, not being there. I think of Joshua, who asked the sun to stay in place so that they can continue their conquest in battle. And I can't remember who it was against, but one of the Canaanites groups of people. It was who?
It was AI.
Yeah. This also speaks of the idea of they went away, right? At the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming. Although in the end, it talks about them disappearing and turning to, and it becoming dark. The very, very end of Revelation, right? Chapter 21, 23 actually talks about there being no need for a sun or a moon, right? Because God is giving light to the nations. And so that definitely seems to be speaking of things going on at the end. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. Again, God's people are the saints of Israel, right? And the nations who encompass that, that name, the remnant, and that's who the anointed here, I think is referring to. When God comes in the end, it's not salvation for those who will be judged, but it is salvation for those who get to go with God, and that's, I think, the idea there. Again, you trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. That to me is clearly talking about the entire earth and the peoples. But again, that's my take on it. I think that's a pretty common take on that verse there. So maybe it's not my take. Maybe that's just what most scholars think. Verse 16, I really think that this gets to you just really shows you who Habakkuk is and who we all should aspire to be, especially as we go through times of struggle and we see things and we don't understand. I heard in my inward parts trembled. Decay enters my bones. And again, why? Because I wait quietly, knowing what is to come. God has just revealed to him the distress that's going to come upon his people. But again, you see this blind faith, Habakkuk, because he does at the end, I will exalt in the Lord and I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength. And he made my feet like hinds feet, and that's referring to deer having quick feet, right? Agile feet, a way of getting away or running. And there's a couple cross references there that I copied in. but I just think that ultimately, when things don't make sense and when you don't understand, you go read through the book of Habakkuk, because he is just an amazing individual in his ability to be honest in his misunderstanding and his questioning of God's righteousness, and yet at the end, he's willing to basically, to throw his hands up and say, at the end of the day, I still am going to trust in God, and God will save me. And that's ultimately what we all strive to be, or to seek, or have that sort of paradigm, I guess. So I don't know what you guys think of those, but man, that's a pretty cool song. I told Brandon, I said we need to, like Sons of Korah does with all the Psalms. Somebody needs to put this to music, because there's some amazing stuff in here.
Mhm. The one thing that I just noticed in verse 13, it is, you were talking about the people there. Well, that term anointed is Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, I kind of see that as connecting to Yeshua there, because it's saying that it's talking about the salvation of his people. Well, who is our savior, right? It's the Messiah,
Yeah.
who struck down the head of the wicked house, or the house of evil, right? And that's a theme we see in the New Testament a lot. They talk about the after the resurrection, about Messiah putting all his enemies under his feet. So I just see that. I see that being connected to Messiah there in that verse.
In verse 11, this Habakkuk 3 is what I use to introduce the day of the Lord to people, and I just packaged it in a sermon with Isaiah 13:13 and Isaiah 24, where the earth is split open. And I was basically trying to use some of these prophecies of the day of the Lord to talk about the creation of the bottomless pit that you have in Revelation, so that the earth is shaken not by an earthquake but by a space quake. That in Isaiah 13 it says, the heavens and the earth were shaken, and the earth was moved out of its place, so that God is left with evacuating his people from the earth, and then at a later time creates a new heavens and a new earth. In Isaiah, I'm trying to remember which Isaiah passage it's coming from, but it talks about that God is summoning it. It's in that same Isaiah 13 passage that God is summoning his forces from the deepest part of the universe to come and save and evacuate the people from earth. And he will punish the heavens and punish the kings of the earth in the earth, so that the earth and the solar system no longer exists. It all goes down a black hole, and God has to dock the heavenly city with the earth, not in our solar system, but in another part of the Milky Way, maybe. Speculation. This is an Adventist story point in the nebula of Orion.
And so it's that idea of physically actually taking the earth and is that what you're saying? Physically moving it and putting it somewhere else in the universe.
Yeah, and the devil and his angels can't get off because it's hurtling through space, and it's all just broken into rubble shooting through space.
I like your term spacequake.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, it does say the heavens and earth shaken, and it will be taken out of its place. Is that a pretty common belief? I mean, and that's kind of that idea of the 1,000 years not being on Earth, right? Being somewhere else entirely. That tends to be most Adventists. That's a pretty normal belief for Adventists, right?
Yeah. I think I'm the only one that puts the different Isaiah passages with those Revelation ones, but almost all Adventists see the 1,000-year period as this desolation of ruin, and there's nothing on this earth.
Right. Well, and we spent what not 6 months, but what 4 months, right? Dexter's kind of going through that and going through the views that you guys have seem to be pretty in line with that, right?
Yes, I think that he elaborates on it more, but he has a more of a quantum physics outlook. I think maybe using the wrong term there. I would like to just add a very simplistic thought that just came to me. We look at the beginning of the prayer, and it's very positive. Mm-hmm. O Lord, I've learned of your renown. I am awed, O Lord, by your deeds. Renew them in these years. O make them known in these years. Though angry, may you remember compassion. Mm-hmm. And then at the very end, on verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, exalt in the God who delivers me. My Lord God is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's, makes me stride upon the heights. It's bookend by his faith, and I really like this: positive at the beginning, positive at the end, and kind of all the woes and all the problems and things like that he deals with in the middle. Just really like the idea of, hey, no matter what happens at the beginning, it starts with faith and ends with faith. I don't know, I just like that.
Yeah. And it's a great place to stop, because that's ultimately what we are called, right? The righteous shall live by their faith, and Habakkuk recorded that, and at the end records a song stating that again, or showing that again. So what a great book, man. I don't think I knew the righteous that shall live by their faith came from Habakkuk. That's pretty much so it. That was the extent of it before we started this study. So and kind of, you see how as Nahum was to the northern kingdom in his proclamations against Assyria, so Habakkuk, among others, was used to give a proclamation against the people of Babylon, who were the conquerors of the southern kingdom. And I think that when you see that, it's so much easier to be able to access this scripture and some of the others. So I continue to push, and I sent it out in an email that the book of Jeremiah would be a great adjunct reading to as we're going through this. Jeremiah is what I think is probably, it's long, but it's one of the easier prophets to read because so much of it is narrative. It has some very specific prophecies against surrounding countries, and nations, and it has a lot of some end time stuff as well. I think what we'll do is maybe just pick one part of Jeremiah just to read through as kind of our end of this phase going into the next one, and I'll send that out to you guys when I send out this recording. But Obadiah is where we are going to head next. So if you want to read through that, it's a very long reading. It's one entire chapter. So it might take you a while to get through it, but yeah. Yeah. So again, if you're looking to dig a little bit deeper and read a little bit more, specifically the last 3 chapters of Jeremiah, I think are worth reading, because they are the prophecies that God gave to Jeremiah against Babylon, and also kind of the end of the final, what was finally to be of the city of Jerusalem before the 70-year exile. So thanks again for coming along. I like I said, man, every time we do this study, I'm always just like, man, this is pretty cool. So,
and this has also reinforced the idea that no matter what, at the end, God wins.
That's right, God wins.